All right, back in 1 Timothy. So if you have a Bible or you want to pull it up on a mobile device or something, 1 Timothy chapter 5. We're going to be back in there. Today, I want you to be familiar with it. We took a week off. Big thanks to Pastor Dave Hansen for coming and filling in for me while we were gone, gallivanting, as you saw, traveling across the countryside in Montana. We are picking up at verse 3. We're working our way all the way down to verse 16. This is the subject of widows in the early church. Within a letter that Paul wrote to Timothy about strengthening the local church in the city of Ephesus. So we'll start at verse 3, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 3. Honor widows who are truly widows, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their household and to make some return to their parents. For this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command these things as well so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, and having a reputation for good works. If she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work, but refused to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry, and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Beside that, they learn to be idlers, going about from house to house, and not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed after Satan. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. Okay, so I want to begin by catching you up or reminding you of last week, or 2 weeks ago, I explained 2 weeks ago, I gave you an overview of how the early church handled widows and orphans and how the Old Testament did that, how God responds to those who are widows and orphans. I defined a widow for you in the New Testament context is not just a woman whose husband had died, but it could also be applied to a woman whose husband had abandoned her or had been arrested and she was left destitute in some way. It doesn't always apply to a woman whose husband had died in this case. It could be abandonment or divorce, particularly if that divorce was ruled by the community as being wrong or an abandonment by the man. I also reminded you 2 weeks ago that there is a people element to this when we make definitions, when we think about what the church is doing with its resources, with its time, how it cares for people, that we're dealing with people who have lost their spouse, and with that comes loneliness, comes a total change of the rhythms of life, where what you used to do is now completely changed. I quoted an older woman who described how she had lost her husband and felt as though she had lost her place in the community as well as a result of that, because it radically changed the way she lived. I got home last night at about 10 o'clock. Some of you guys got home a little bit later who were with us because I was driving with Kyle, and Kyle was like pedal to the metal. We're getting back to Michigan. And I got home, and I had, for the entire week, slept in a bed that I think was more comfortable than what the other guys had, which I appreciate their generosity. But it was still not very comfortable. And I kept looking for Elizabeth. She wasn't there. Instead, it was my headphones and my earplugs and my book and something else, my phone. That was all beside me, but those are not warm and cuddly. And when you lose a spouse, you don't have warm and cuddly anymore. And I thought about that last night as I was going to bed, how different that is, how different life would be if she weren't alive. And I just thanked the Lord for his goodness and the days that we get. That's the human reality of this, right? But at that time, I reminded you 2 weeks ago that the widow was destitute in many cases. There wasn't the infrastructure like we have today, where there is Social Security and retirement funds and other social services that can help people out who have various needs, whether they come from government or nonprofit sources. They didn't have as a robust a system. Oftentimes, a widow was left to glean from the fields, which is why God had in the Old Testament a law for Israel that you couldn't take everything off of your field. You had to leave some of it so that people like Naomi and Ruth could come back and have something to eat. That's how destitute they were. And that didn't change in Jesus' day, and it didn't change a few decades later within the early church as Timothy was shepherding and overseeing the local church in Ephesus. And this local church in Ephesus had a significant number of widows. We don't know how many, but enough that Paul makes the largest section of this, almost the largest section of this letter, about widows. It is the largest continuous topic within the letter. And you wonder about that. Why is this such a big deal? And I have tried to process this for months now. Why is this such a big deal to a local church? Is it just a matter of policy and practice and bylaws and things that we write up, or is there more to it? And I told you 2 weeks ago that this is at the very heart of God, to care for the powerless, for those who do not have. God is by nature a provider and a protector. And it would make sense that his people would display the same sort of behavior. I didn't go this far 2 weeks ago, but if you will think back over, or if you know anything about the Old Testament history and how God leveled accusation against his people, it wasn't only because they were sexually immoral or they were getting into all sorts of idolatry or worship. It's also because there was no more justice. There was no more care. And I mentioned to you at the end of 2 weeks ago, one of the key points I made to you is that when a culture, a government, or an individual abandons the way of the Lord, they will most often become an oppressor to the vulnerable and the powerless. And that oppression doesn't always come directly. It can come by ignoring. It can come by choosing to look past the person in need. The church is called to better. The church is called to more than that. This is why James said this: religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. Think of the two things, all the things James could have said about the way we practice faith, because that's the word religion. I know we might say, well, we don't like religion, we like relationship with Jesus and whatever, but reclaim the original idea of the word religion, which is that it's a way of expressing our devotion and love to the Lord as a response to the grace of God through Jesus Christ. That's its original idea. It's a process of thought and action built up as a way of showing our faith. It certainly can go wrong. Religion can go sour. But James says religion that is pure means religion that is right with God, right according to the standard of his character and the standard of his morals that he has given to us. The religion that is undefiled before God is to visit orphans and widows in their affliction. If we go back and I just summarize with you the life of Jesus, we know that that's hugely what he did. He taught, he proclaimed the kingdom, he went from place to place telling them that the kingdom of God was at hand, that salvation was near, but he also healed the sick, the lame. He went to where the outcasts were. Remember, he went to the pool in Jerusalem where all the poor and destitute and handicapped were waiting for the pool to be stirred. And he took a man and healed him. His early church, shortly after that, followed the same pattern. As Peter and John went into the temple to pray that day, what did they do? They saw the man begging, and they healed him. By the grace and power of God, they healed that man. The demon-possessed man who was under the oppression of Legion had the demons cast out. And the widow whose son had died. Jesus only raised how many people to life? Lazarus, and I think just this guy. This one young man who had died and left his mom without anybody to help. He went in the funeral procession, and this is the thing that strikes me. He didn't hide this one. Do you notice that? Like he hid a lot of other things. Like the leper who came to him is like, if you're willing, you can make me clean. He's like, I'm willing, be clean. And he heals him, and then he's like, go and do the things you're supposed to do, and don't tell anybody about me. But in this case, he just healed the woman, was like, woman, your son. That's the heart of God. And if it's not the heart of his church, then we are wandering from the heart of God. And that's a bad place to be. So that's what we talked about last week, but we want to get into practical, or 2 weeks ago, but we want to get into some practical things today within our text, because this is the longest section in the letter. Take a look at verse 3. Honor widows who are truly widows. We're just going to deal with the word honor for a moment, and then after that, verse 4 to 5, or 4 to 8 is another topic that we'll deal with. But I want to deal with honor and what that means. This section is all about honor. He says, honor widows, and then honor elders who teach well, and then there's honor your masters. 3 sections within this about how we treat each other. And the word honor has a slightly different emphasis in each usage. But here, this honor means that we are going to provide something for the widow that meets the relational, financial, social needs that this woman is going to have. That we step into what's lacking and we meet it in some way. This word honor primarily means, in the context of elders and widows, providing some sort of financial care. And so the first point I want to make for you in this is that the church may do a lot of things in our world today, but the church needs to make a priority of caring for widows and orphans. I'll add. The church needs to make a priority out of that. And it sounds like the church in Ephesus was making a priority of that, but they were also making a mess of it. And that often happens when we're compassionate, doesn't it? I want you to think about the way we are compassionate sometimes. Sometimes our hearts ache within us for somebody that we blindly bring things to them that really don't meet a need. An example of this is short-term mission trips for kids. They're great. They're not terrible. But they often leave the ministry that they go to, especially overseas, with more work to do when they're gone than less. That's not always the case, but it is often a complaint of missionaries on the field who take in short-term mission trips with youth, particularly dominantly youth, that they make more trouble for them than they do blessing. And that's because we're so compassionate, we're so ready to help, and that those people are so ready to receive that help that they just open their doors and they just say, hey, come and do it. And as a result, we pour out compassion without thought to what the real need is. Even at the camp this last week, we're like, what do you actually need? Right? What will make this most effective for you for this trip? We had a number of jobs they set out before us, didn't we, Jake? And we had to prioritize those jobs right away. There's 15 of us. We could have spread out to all the different jobs they'd given, but we wouldn't have gotten much progress on any of them. And so we made a list, kind of really quick, right? The barn is a priority. The cabins are a priority because the cabins make room for people to come and hear the gospel and be a part of the camp ministry. But the skirting around the pool is not crucial. The metal that's going to go around the pool there at the camp, that's not going to change the pool. It's just going to mean kids run under it. And some counselor's going to have to say, don't run under there, over and over. That's all that's going to mean. But if you don't fix the cabin, you're going to miss 8 beds if it's not done. You see what I mean? But sometimes in compassion, we become really blind. Church ministries are like that all the time. Somebody comes in, I'm destitute, I need help. And there's not really an evaluation, and we give them help, and nothing changes. They remain in the destitute condition. And then they go to the next ministry and they get resources. And then a month later they go to the next ministry and they get resources. And nothing really changes. When I started here as the pastor 14 years ago, there were a number of families who weren't even necessarily part of North Dickinson who would come by here and ask for money. And we have benevolence, we have charity that we set aside within our budget to be able to help people. And we also will help people in need out of the blue if we need to, right? That isn't part of our budget, because if we're just constrained by our budget, we're not really compassionate. And those people would come in, and they'd say, well, we don't have enough money for rent. Okay, cool. What's it going to take to get you that rent for this month? And let's sit down and talk about your finances. That was my rule. Why don't you have enough money for rent? Why? Well, maybe it's major medical bills, right? And now they don't have enough to pay for it. Okay, it's something outside of their ability to control. Maybe it's that they're not working. They don't want to work. They're really content with, or maybe they're in a situation where their husband is gone and there's no one to help out, and they can't just go off and work because they can't get childcare or whatever because they can't afford it. There's a whole bunch of factors that need to be filtered through and determine whether or not what really is going to help that person. Sometimes help is not help. Think about that. If you don't understand the need, you may not actually be helping. Isn't that fair? In the medical world, isn't that true? I had a physical therapist before my really great one who was hurting me because he didn't take the time within the VA system to understand my condition and what was going on with my back. And so he was hurting me. I was getting worse, not better. And he kept telling me, it'll get better, it'll get better, it'll get better. But he never really evaluated me. And then somebody, an angel within our fellowship, mentioned somebody else to me. And I went to the VA to try to get that physical therapist. And I want to tell you the miracle that happened, okay? You can't just pick your doctor in the VA. But I went in there and the power was out. They couldn't look up what doctor I had. And they're like, well, who are you supposed to see? And I was like, Mark. And I wasn't, I lied. I repented later, but I lied. And how I justified that is I am supposed to see somebody better. And I went in and I saw Mark and he's like, oh, I haven't seen you before. And I'm like, I know. And he took a full look, head to toe, of my body and the condition. And I thought he was doing some sort of magic stuff. He helped me so much in about 4 or 5 weeks. I went from not being able to move my left leg to being able to bring it up to 90 degrees. Because he evaluated the need. He evaluated my condition. He understood what was actually going to help me. The same thing is true in compassion within the church. Sometimes we get so blind by that emotion of our hurt for somebody that we don't take the time to know their need. And then the flip side of this is sometimes when you take the time to assess a need, you seem cold and indifferent. You're not cold and indifferent when you're assessing a need. So this family that came to the church asking for money, I assessed their need. I saw that they all had cell phones. I saw that they had a wonderful satellite TV system. And I knew generally what all of those cost. And I said, boy, so you don't have diapers, you don't have rent. But if you get rid of 3 of your phones and you either downgrade or cancel your cable, you'll have rent. Oh, we're not going to do that. Okay? We're going to help you one time. And then I'd like you to go through 3 or 4 weeks with me on financial management and wise prioritizing of your money, and then we'll see about providing other help for you after that. Guess what? Never saw him again. Because sometimes the need that we're meeting is anchored to a bunch of sin. And when we start to assess the need, we expose it. I know that the medical professionals see this all the time when people come into the emergency room and they have conditions that are because of alcohol or drugs or something else, right? The church has to make a priority of compassion, and particularly the care of widows. And Paul sets out within this text to make sure that we know how to do that without just becoming emotional. It's not that we don't feel. It's not that we don't hurt or ache for people who are in need, but that we do so with real love. You know this as a parent. You are not loving your child if you spoil them, right? But yet you may have compassion. I know multiple times where my kids, when they were little, would ask for something, and man, my father's heart would ache to be able to give it to them, but I knew that I couldn't just give them everything, and it wasn't wise to get it. But if I just went off of my niceness or wanting to make sure they liked me, I would do all sorts of stupid stuff that would hurt my child and our money. Make sense? This is why at the very end of our text, verse 16, listen to what he says. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened so that it may care for those who are truly widows. What Paul is saying to the church here is, be careful to make sure that you identify the real need and meet that need, or you are going to spread yourself so thin that you don't meet any need. You don't actually help. You're going to spread resources out so much that you're not going to have the focus to do what you actually need to do. Now, it must be said that even though the church must make a priority out of caring for widows and those who are poor and powerless, the church's priority above this is the gospel of Christ, which has already been mentioned throughout the first part of this letter, that we would be people of prayer who pray that God would save all people because he desires all to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. That we need to have good leaders who live out the gospel, who can anchor the church in its teaching so that we would not drift from the gospel. That we need to put down false teaching and make the teaching of Christ central to our fellowship. All of that has already been the main priority of the church, right? That's, if you will, the right hand of the church. And now the left hand is, what do we do with these widows? What do we do with those who are in need and need compassion? The word honor, I think we could break down in particular with widows into 3 categories, possibly more. But I would go with these 3. If you think of more, great, write them down, share them with me. I'd be interested to hear other ways that you would apply this. But honor doesn't just mean that we go, hey, hope you're having a good day. I think it is, first, relational honor. What I mean by this is that we give our time and we build our relationships with those who have lost their spouse. We have dinners. We spend time. We involve ourselves with them as much as a widow is willing to let us be involved. As a church family, a family of families, brothers and sisters in Christ, I think we have an obligation to that. And it's something we can do even if they have believing family, because sometimes that believing family is far away. Relational honor means that we give of our time and we build relationships with those who've lost their spouse so that they are not losing out on the relational parts of community that God has given to us. Isn't that often what happens? It's lonely. And Genesis did tell us that it's not good for man to be alone. And I do think that's general man. Yes, it's not good for Adam to be alone. He probably had the garden looking like a bachelor pad, just like our bunkhouse. It stank. We talked multiple times about if our wives were here, this would be a very different space right now. It isn't good. And we need to look and notice each other, notice those needs, notice the widows in our fellowship, those who've lost their spouse, man or woman, and figure out how to make time with them. Holidays. I mentioned the other day, not to bring Isla up, but Isla's the primary widow I think of, and I love Isla dearly. Relational honor means that we make time with Isla and other widows in our church, that we think about what's going on when the power's out. I mentioned that 2 weeks ago, remember? Power's out, and suddenly someone texts me and says, hey, is Isla doing okay? Oh my goodness, I haven't even thought of that. Does Isla have heat? Does she have what she needs? And I know some of you in this fellowship help with trash and help with plowing and other things like that. Praise God for that. Thank you for that. The second type of honor that we give to widows in some situations is financial honor. We make sure that a widow has what she needs. This may include weekly support, or in most cases in our modern day, finding good financial advice. Modern day, we often have widows who have their husband's pension, perhaps some retirement, Social Security, but we also have a lot of sharks who are ready to jump in and take as much as they can. Scammers who come through online and make you think that your data has been exposed. If that happens to you, please talk to me before you click on anything. I will make sure that you understand that you haven't been hacked. Or maybe you have, but I'll make sure you haven't. Do not give anyone your bank account information through an email or phone call even. Don't give it to any of them unless you know it's actually the person that you've met at your bank, right? Those are things we do to care for widows. That's financial honor. Sometimes it might be a literal financial gift to help out with needs. It certainly was in the first century situation. Not long ago, there was a community business in the UP taking advantage of widows as it related to the internet. It ticked me off. So I called that company and I told them, I know that you are charging more money than what you are giving to this person, and they do not understand that. Well, sir, I want to talk to your manager. Well, our manager's busy right now. Okay, I'm really good at social media. I will make sure that the entire UP knows that you are taking advantage of a widow within the next 3 days. I will spend the money to make sure the entire UP knows that you are taking from a widow. I suddenly was talking to a manager. Oh, sir, I think we can fix that. Yeah, I bet you can. That's sometimes what it looks like to take care of a widow, man or woman, because there are a bunch of people that want to take advantage, because that's what a people does whose hearts are far from God. That's what people do whose hearts are far from God. Social honor as well. We honor a widow by providing social honor, and what I mean by this is that we pay particular attention to them, making sure that their homes are in good condition, their driveways and so on. There's a relational component to this, but I mean more than just helping out with trash. I mean, on the relational side, I mean that personal connection where you're sitting down and having a meal, having coffee together, inviting them into different aspects of your life. But then social honor would be that we have a special place in our church for a widow. In the early church, this sometimes looked like a group of widows who served the church on behalf, who served the church in a special way and received some sort of compensation for that. There was, at least in the first century, second century, there was a number of the churches had these cohorts of widows who would serve the church in various ways. An example of this in the modern day is Pastor Sriraj in India, Agape Outreach Mission that we have been partnered with for some time. Their orphan home that they've been building, their orphan home. I'm tired. Their orphanage that they've been building for the last number of years that isn't quite finished yet, but is really close to being finished. Their plan to staff that is to take the believing widows and house them there, and they become the teachers and the facilitators of that space for the orphans. Brilliant. I think it's brilliant. Is every widow going to be qualified for that? No. And that's actually what Paul gets into. Some of the widows are self-indulgent, so they're not going to be leading that sort of thing. But some of the widows are faithful and full of good works and have loved their husbands and families and could really value that space and time. Have you seen some of the daycare groups going to nursing homes? In Europe, particularly in the northern countries, some of the daycares and nursing homes are together, two facilities in one. And yes, there's some separation. There has to be for a number of reasons, but they bring them together periodically through the day. The little kids take the elderly for walks. And you know what they do? They walk. I watched one video of this where this woman is in England. She's like, I never walk. I never go out. I'd never go outside. I look at the sun from my window and here this little girl would come in and say, let's walk together. Draw her pictures and bring it to her. And it just made her life wonderful. That's social honor. Our culture has lost that, and the church can't lose it. The Chinese culture has had a high place for the elderly for generations, thousands of years, and they're losing it because they're adopting Western culture. The Chinese population has the largest number of elderly in the world, even outside of India, even more than India. And by 2030, they will be the third largest country, if they were a country, in the world. They outpopulate the United States. You you could replace the entire population of the United States, I think, by double or triple with 65 and over in China. And you guess what they're not doing? Because they killed all their babies. They have no one to take care of them. China knows it. The Western culture has moved so far away from God that we are neglecting that significantly. That's relational, social, financial honor. That's one way we honor. It's far more than just saying, hey, I honor you, right? It costs something in a relationship. The second point I want to make for you is that the church must, in this priority, manage its resources so that true widows are actually helped. Okay, so in the text, if you look here, there's a number of instructions that Paul gives. Starting at verse 4. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return for their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers. But she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. Command and teach these things. This first section, 4 to 8, is really about if this widow has family, let the family do the job. My grandmother was not a widow. Bubba was right there with her. But I knew that Bubba had his work cut out for him in trying to take care of my grandmother. Not that he's not capable, but it's hard to be a caregiver, and some of you know that. And so I moved back from Michigan because of this verse right here. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. I dropped out of my master's program at the University of New Mexico. I gave up on the doorstep of China, and I came here, not to toot my horn, but because I believed so strongly that I had a responsibility to my grandmother. Some of it's emotional, some of it's familial, some of it's historical within our family, and some of it is just this is what God says to do. And so I came, and I'm still here. Sorry. Blame the Lord. But it was so convicted, and man, I can't tell you the tension that was in me in 2006, 2007. Man, I was on the doorstep of China. My dreams as a young man to help serve the Chinese church in some way. But God, man may plan his way, but God directs his steps, right? And I know I saw this verse and I was like, man, Lord, I have a priority to my family. You know, my grandmother sat with me for months, or at least a month, when I was born, because I was a preemie. I was in an incubator sort of thing as a little boy, and she stayed by my side. And I got to be by her side as she passed away. That's a blessing. It's way better than China. It's way better to be with somebody, face to face with them, sharing life with them, sharing hurts with them, rather than glued to this. Isn't it? Little bunny trail there. The church has to manage its resources, and we have to assess the true need. And Paul gives us 3 categories: a true widow, a young widow, and a selfish widow. I would say a widow with family, maybe 4 categories here: a true widow, a young widow, a selfish widow, and a widow with family. If a widow has family, then the family needs to take the priority and care for their mom, right? That's a priority. It's a non-negotiable for God. I mean, listen to that language. If anyone does not provide for his relatives, especially for members of his household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. I thought, man, why such strong language? Because as we've seen 2 weeks ago, this is the very heart of God. And if true religion is to care for the poor and the powerless, then our outworking of love that has been poured into our hearts must reach out to those in need, particularly those of our own blood. And then after that, those of our own church family. And then after that, those of our larger community. So the first filter that we go through is whether she is selfish or selfless, whether she is dependent on the Lord or trusting in her financial reserves. That's what we see in this text, in that section. She has put her hope in God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. The contrast is between this self-indulgent woman who is really dead while she lives, who lives for herself, who is all about herself, who turns all of her money and resources on herself, and then the selfless woman who is crying out to the Lord, dependent upon Him, asking God to help him or to help her. That's the true widow, filter number one. We see widows like that in our fellowship. That's a high priority person to care for. The self-indulgent, do you know how we care for them? Stop being selfish. That's how you care for them. Don't be so self-centered. Love others well. Depend on the Lord. That's how you care for someone who's self-indulgent. You confront it. That's why Paul says, command these things as well. That's a strong thing for a young Timothy to do, to go to an older woman that, if you'll remember, he's supposed to treat as a mother in chapter 5, verse 1, or chapter 5, verse 2. He's supposed to go to that self-indulgent woman and say, enough. You're being selfish. That's genuine care. The text tells us that this true widow is left all alone. She has no children or grandchildren. She has no one to protect her. She has set her hope on God, which means she recognizes that He is her provider and protector. This true widow as well, if you look down a little bit further, this true widow is over 60 years old. And Paul says this is because younger widows wanted to remarry or were distracted by the desires for family life or the raising of children or something else. So Paul makes this hard line at 60 years old. She's been faithful to her husband. Doesn't mean she's been married only once. She could have been, her husband could have died and she could have remarried. We know that in the text, Paul does not forbid remarriage here. So this woman could have had multiple husbands die and been a widow and still been worthy. But was she faithful to her husband? And then she is rich in good works, the scripture tells us as well. She is devoted to good works as well. Also, see this verse 9. Having been the wife of one husband, having the reputation for good works, if she has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, has cared for the afflicted. So you think about these good works. Some of them are the raising of her family, the being hospitable and generous, of serving and being a part of a local church, and of caring for those who are afflicted. Those are some of the good works that widows, or these women who are true widows, that Paul is using as a category to define them or filter them through. The other category here, so we have the faithful widow or the true widow, the widow with a family, the self-indulgent widow, and then the widow who's too young. And Paul's point here, if we look at the text, verse 11, but refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passions draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. This doesn't mean that they're leaving Christ. That's not what Paul is saying. The word faith can also mean what they believe, what they claim, what they proclaim about themselves. So here might be a woman who says, I'm completely devoted to the Lord. I'm going to be completely trusting in the Lord. And then a little while later, she's like, yeah, no, I'm not. I'm not going to do that. And Paul took that pretty seriously. He himself had completely devoted himself to the Lord rather than to raising of a family. And so that's what was going on perhaps in this situation where younger widows were maybe in their grief, were making vast claims of what they wanted to do or what they would do for the Lord. And then as their grief, the process of grief subsided and they started to kind of go back to a normal rhythm of life, they desired family, they desired a husband again. But they would make these bold claims. And so Paul says, don't enroll these younger women because they end up wanting to basically go back and raise families, or even worse, they become idlers, which means lazy people who do not provide or work for themselves, and busybodies and gossips saying what they should not. Now that phrase, saying what they should not, should lead us back to a little bit of chapter 1, where Paul says that there are people teaching, thinking that they understand the law, and they're going around teaching what they should not teach. So shut them down. It could be that within Ephesus there were young widows who were being supported by the church financially, who were then going from house to house and spreading whatever lies were going through the church. And Paul would say, no, we need to cut that out. Because in that idleness and that gossip and being a busybody, this means they're meddling and they're spreading. They're meddling in people's lives where they don't need to meddle, and they're spreading things that shouldn't be spread, which ends up like yeast, spreading it through the loaf of the church. Right? So that's the second point here. We need to assess the true need and prioritize our resources for true widows, and Paul gives us that those categories there. If they have family, they move there, and the family should care for them. If they're self-indulgent, they need to be corrected. If they're too young, they need to be redirected towards managing their homes, raising a family, loving their family, being rich in good works. And that leads me to that third point, which I've mentioned already through this, is that we need to meet the actual need. If it's the widow who is a true widow, we need to provide for them. Provide time, provide resources, open up our lives to them if it's a true widow. Does that make sense? We need to provide for them in some way. Second, for those that who have parents who are widows, we need to encourage them to take care of their family. We need to help them understand how they could do that. We need to help walk through the resources within our community that can help them care for their mom or their dad. We need to correct widows who are self-indulgent and encourage widows who are young to be focused on their family, to love their family, to raise their family. This is how Paul lays this text. And at the heart of this, I've asked myself the whole time, what does this have to do with the strength and well-being of the church, with the instruction that Paul gives Timothy to guard the deposit that's been entrusted to him? Every local church, even in the first century, has financial resources and has people resources. And if we don't make a priority of those, we spread that out so thin that we actually do very little. Or we do things that aren't really meeting needs. Because sometimes whatever you're passionate about may not be what the Lord is making a priority of. And the church may shift towards a passion that really isn't a need. Like when I was younger, the church I was in shifted to fair trade because we wanted to make sure farmers in the third world country were taken care of. And so they would give tons of money to fair trade things, and they would buy coffee from fair trade farmers. And go ahead, buy the coffee, fine. But we were given a significant amount of the budget to things like that at the neglect of true need within our community. Paul's redirecting the church towards healthy community. And here's why I think this is so valuable. In Acts, when the church gets their widow distribution right, in Acts chapter 6, remember they appoint the guys to take care of the distribution of food? When that happens, it says that the church had peace, continued to grow, and many priests came to the faith. So what happened when the church did two things? We're not going to stop preaching the word. We need to appoint some people who can really focus on this need. And so the apostles keep on teaching the church, keep on preaching the word, and they appoint people to this task of caring for those who are poor and powerless, distributing food and resources in a way that is healthy, accountable, takes the best practices into consideration so that things are not abused. And they appoint these 6 guys who are faithful and love Jesus and are responsible and have proven themselves in the community. And as they start to fix the distribution of these resources to the widows in the larger church within the Jerusalem region, the church has peace. That's one of the things we're to be praying for as a church in 1 Timothy chapter 1. The church not only has peace, but it grows together in the faith. And the reason that is that the compassion has not taken over the teaching of the truth. so that all we do is compassion. Years ago, our denomination wanted to plant a church at K.I. Sawyer. If you don't know much about K.I. Sawyer, as they turned it into a community rather than into a military base, the housing there was very inexpensive, and they pumped a bunch of people in there. And the community there now, without getting too into detail, is either fixed income retired on one side of the base, transitionary families who are looking for cheap housing, trying to get out of wherever they were at and move into Marquette or Nagani or Ishpeming. And then the third category are the destitute who are living in the townhouses. There was a church that tried to go in there and plant years ago. And we talked with that pastor, and he said, I have been working at this for 10 years, and I am tired, and I am worn out, and I got nothing. And I was like, well, what's the deal? He's like, we have tried to establish a local church, and everything we have done, we have just become a crisis center. That's all we are. All we do is respond to crisis. And I learned in that moment that this was a church that had just become one more social welfare institution at K.I. Sawyer. And they had no way. They tried to turn it. And I remember I told our leaders as we were looking at planting there, we have to be careful to plant a genuine church. We have to put a real group of believers there who love Jesus, who will gather together around his word, who will be devoted to the gospel and the teaching of Christ, who will teach God's people to order their lives around Christ's teaching, who will help people come out of those places and not just be turned into a crisis intervention center. That's sometimes what can happen in the local church. We become so busy with all of those things that we forget the balance that actually is in this letter. A balance of gospel preaching and good leaders who will hold the gospel with truth, and a compassionate heart that sees the need, identifies the poor and the powerless, and looks to help with that in a legitimate way. Not just moved by our emotions, but moved by truth, so that real help comes. So if I would close this out, my prayer for us is that we would truly honor those who have no means of support and have shown themselves to be devoted to the Lord in good works. We would actually take that real seriously in the 21st century in Felch Mountain. Let me just say on that, by the way, when Mission Covenant was looking for a pastor and they weren't sure they were going to find one, particularly one who wanted to live in the parsonage, Chris Murray had a fantastic idea. I think it's fantastic. They weren't looking like they were going to be able to find someone. And she said, what if we took our parsonage and we made it a home for our widows? And she's like, I and some of the other ladies, we would take care of them and we would love them and we would help them. And I was like, that's awesome. And had that come to fruition, I'd have been coming to our elder board saying, let's support that. Let's see how we can make that happen. That'd be beautiful. Because, there are some believing women who are not part of our local fellowship in our community who are isolated. You may know them better than I do. And if you do, let's figure out how we can help them. Because we want to honor widows who are truly widows. Another thing that I pray we take from this is that we would promote within the lives of young women and older women in our church a deep trust in the Lord, a richness in good works, a hospitality. The very descriptions that Paul has here for widows. This isn't just something they did after they became widows. It's something they did as women. And it's a beautiful picture of how women bless and serve and bring vitality to a local church. This isn't the only way, by the way, but this is a great picture of that. This fullness of good works. Do you remember when Tabitha died in Acts? Dorcas. Everyone knows her by Dorcas. Okay, Dorcas. When she died, what was going on when Peter came there? All the widows were gathered and they were crying. And they were showing Peter all of the clothes she had made for them. And so God, in his graciousness to them, raised her from the dead. And I bet the clothes that she made after that were really cool. But this was a woman, apart from her being raised from the dead, who was devoted to caring for these women in some way. And she may not have had a lot of money, but she had the means to be able to make some sweet clothes for them. Third thing I hope that we do as a church, and as you think about your own situation, that you take care of your own family as a priority. Look up, look at your family, and ask the Lord, where can I help? Where can I serve? Where can I bless? Who is in need, and how can I meet it? It's a big section, and I know I've kind of jumped around in it, but it's a very important section, and I've come to realize that the reason the Lord put this in the letter is because this is his heart. This is him. When you see the church doing what Paul describes here, you are seeing God at work in the world. And I pray that he would work through us in this way. Let's pray. Father, as we have looked at your text this morning, opened up your word, we thank you that you speak to us in it. We thank you that you have given us the letter of 1 Timothy, which helps us to see bits and pieces of how we are to be as your people, as a church family. Help us in this to do better, to see true need and to meet it, to not be led merely by our emotions and so spread our resources that we don't actually meet true needs. Help us, Lord, to keep a balance between the preaching of the gospel and the teaching of truth and the discipling of men and women with the meeting of needs within our community. At the family level, help us to be aware of our own families, to be ready to meet needs, to set our lives in such a way that we can be available to our widows that might be in our family or those who are without in some way. Help us, Father, as a church to meet the actual need, providing for those who are truly widows, making a priority of our time, our thoughts, and our resources, encouraging those in our church family to care for their own, and correcting those who are self-indulgent or gossips or busybodies, encouraging them and correcting them to be devoted to the Lord and to your work in the world. And Father, through our desire to be in line with your word, would you please do what you did in the church in Acts? Would you bring peace in our fellowship, increase it in us? Would you continue to help us grow in our faith through these things as we choose to be obedient to your word? And would you please, Father, spread your word through us as a testimony of a people who are genuinely compassionate and ready to honor those who are truly in need. May that testimony bring you honor. May it draw attention to your true heart. And through our good deeds, through our work, through our love, may people see Jesus and see your great love for this world. In Jesus' mighty name, amen. There is a whole spread over there for you. Please enjoy. If you want some more flowers or candy, ladies, you are welcome to have more candy or flowers. Ladies.